design. The optimal life with ARAEt Barnett. Shine, be an agent of change. The future is alive.
Welcome to the Optimal Life podcast. My name is ARAEt Barnett, and I'm excited for you to be here with me today to learn to help others or help yourself live an optimal life. In today's episode, we're going to cover a very important topic, awareness management. It's important because it lays the foundation for any successful therapeutic journey from wherever you are now to living an optimal life. There's a reason why the ARAEt framework starts with awareness management. ARAEt, of course, stands for awareness management, response management, action, effort, and time management. And the first phases of cognitive response therapy, which really are encapsulated in the first two phases of ARAEt, which is awareness and response, cognitive response therapy is really embedded in there. And the first parts of cognitive response therapy really are about becoming more aware of what you are currently unaware of. I've talked in previous episodes about what we all suffer from, which is the introspection illusion. It's a cognitive bias that basically says we just don't know ourselves as well as we think we do or need to in order to make the changes that we want to make in our lives. So that question that therapist asks, tell me a little bit about yourself, it's actually a really hard question for people to answer. So the research studies that really laid the foundation for cognitive response therapy was aimed at overcoming the introspection illusion, introducing you to yourself so that bias can be overcome. Of course, the way that we did that in the research studies was to build a therapeutic asset called the Language Association and Categorization System, or the LACS. So all the intellectual property that came out of that research study that's now built into CRT and the ARAEt framework is leveraging language in a very specific way to help somebody understand themselves more at a fundamental level. Your psychological structure really drives how you show up and respond to life. And the way that we conceptualize the psychological structure in cognitive response therapy is what we call your mental core. Just like your physical core is the center of your physical strength, stability, and balance, your mental core is the center of your mental strength, stability, and balance. But most of it is just an accumulation. Well, all of it really is just an accumulation of your lived experiences, most of which you're not really aware of. So what drives us in our lives and what constitutes our mental core is really just a consequence or a byproduct of our lived experiences rather than something that we intentionally designed. But it is all our beliefs, our values, our attributes, the good and the bad, by the way. Of course, we have a term called the viruses in CRT that is the way that we conceptualize the not so great parts of our mental core. But all of that together is what drives us of how we show up and respond to life situations. But like I said, it's just a consequence or a byproduct of our lived experiences. We don't really know what the adaptive versus the maladaptive parts, the assets and the liabilities within us. So when somebody asks us what is driving us or motivating us to act in a certain way or behave a certain way, we don't really know. So we are woefully unaware of so much of who we are. So again, the first phases of ARAEt and what's built into cognitive response therapy is to help overcome the introspection illusion. The very first step in that process, and what somebody that becomes certified in CRT or the ARAEt, of course, you head over to ARAEtbarnett.com if you are interested in becoming certified in both in either CRT or the ARAEt framework and really helping others to do exactly what I'm talking about today a little bit. But the whole idea is to start to get a little bit better of an understanding of what the driving forces are. So that first phase is not to fully in the ARAEt framework of awareness management is not to fully overcome the introspection illusion. You don't do that till you get to the response management part to really get clarity about your mental core. But there's sort of the first steps in the journey is broken up into two different aspects. One is physiological awareness. And we'll talk a little bit about that today in today's episode. What is physiological awareness, or what I call internal awareness? What does that mean? And the second part is external awareness. External awareness is actually split into two different parts, which is situational awareness, and interpersonal awareness. So in today's episode, we're going to really walk through a bit of the details about what that internal awareness and external awareness means and the impact that that can have when you really start to get clarity on both of those pieces of the puzzle in your therapeutic journey. And as a coach or a mental health professional, we'll talk a little bit about how do you approach that with your clients. And of course, again, you'll get the full clarity when you take the certification process, because it's part of the certification process to really understand how do you help somebody become more aware of what they're currently unaware of. So let's get some definitions out of the way. So physiological or internal awareness, what do I mean by that? Well, there's popular terms, of course, out there called mindfulness, and both of this type of awareness, both internal and external, it's a little bit of mindfulness is built in there, but this really has to do with the first part is internal and physiological awareness really has to do with understanding what is driving our internal physiological responses. If I was to define somebody that is massively successful in life or somebody that really struggles, it is how well do they respond to and manage the physiological responses of their own bodies. Our bodies are what we call in CRT the response state, which is the chemical and neurological configuration of our bodies at any given time, are constantly changing. The chemicals are surging in our bodies, our neurons are firing, there's all sorts of physiological changes going on at any given time. And they are driving so much of how we show up and respond to life. We learned in one of the previous episodes about predictions. What predictions are exactly what they sound like. Guesses our unconscious mind, our nervous system makes as to what we need to know next in order to survive our next moment. Not thrive, but survive. And those predictions are exactly that. They're guesses to say what type of energy, physiological response do I need to give this person in order to move them away from a perceived threat towards safety? Or if everything's okay, then what do we do about thriving? The next thing, if we get survival right, then we can go seek opportunity, but we got to get survival right first. No reason to seek opportunity if you're no longer alive. So the instinct of this prediction is based on, a lot of it is based on the state of our bodies. And these shifts, these sort of little shifts inside of our bodies that are instigated by the environment, whether it's something obvious like somebody jumps out to surprise us, or it might be something that's a little bit more subtle. Either way, there are physiological changes in our body that if we don't pay attention to can overwhelm us. We hear people say that the anxiety came out of nowhere, or I had a panic attack, but so many times what is happening is we have conditioned our nervous system to, instead of first just giving us a little subtle hint, it goes right to giving us the full bore rush of the chemicals. Why? Because we're not paying attention to the little subtle hints that it's giving us. What are those hints? Little physiological changes, the sensations of our body that is the consequence of the chemical releases of our body. These little stress hormones like a cortisol release or norepinephrine or adrenaline. Adrenaline's, of course, a little bit more extreme, but either way, these little releases of chemicals into our body cause sensations, which we say are the feelings that we have. Now, emotions, the words that we use like fear or anxious or stressed, these are emotion words that we apply to the feelings of our body, which are really rooted in the physiological changes of our body. So the more that we get in tune with these physiological changes, the changes of our response state, the better we get. They're little whispers that if we ignore, they start to talk to us. If we ignore those, they start to yell at us. And if we still ignore it, they're going to shout at us. And then we get swept away by those physiological responses. So the difference between somebody that struggles, somebody that's successful, is that this person that is successful can manage those. The person that struggles is not paying attention and gets swept away by those chemical responses. And also, of course, the consequence of our prediction is not only those physiological changes, those feelings and sensations, but the narratives, the thoughts that show up that can sometimes be negative, and we sort of buy into those. And then we start to kind of buy into those narratives, and then we have a negative spin on things, and things don't go so well in our lives. So the predictions, that's why the predictive response cycles that I discussed in our previous episode are so important, because the prediction drives these feelings and sensations and these narratives that then drive us to respond to life in a certain way. We get feedback from the environment based on that response. That feedback that we get back gets fed back into, guess what? The next prediction, which then drives our response, which then we get a response back. And it just ends up forming this habitual cycle that we follow that ends up, guess what, being our life. So understanding and the punchline of cognitive response therapy and the latter part of the response management part of ARAEt is really disrupting those negative predictive response cycles to redirect them to something that's more positive. But if we don't dial it all the way back to the beginning and start to become more in tune with those physiological changes, those slight changes in our response states, that is going to be a challenge for us. How do you do that? Well, again, your nervous system and your unconscious is always whispering. You just might not be paying attention. And this is where that mindfulness concept that is so popular now comes in. And I'm not going to go through exhaustively all the different ways to do this, but there's breathing techniques, of course. You can literally affect and change your physiological responses just by breathing differently. So if you do quick breaths, you're going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. You do slower, relaxed breaths. You can trigger yourself out of sympathetic nervous system. So all these different great breathing techniques to get yourself more or less excited, move yourself in and out of rest, relax states of mind. So there's breathing. Are you aware of how many times your cadence of your breathing changes in a day? Are you even aware of that? Are you aware right now of your heart and how the fluctuations in your heart rate? All these types of slight physiological changes in your body are telling you that something is there to pay attention to. Now, it might not be anything, because your nervous system, just like your immune system, kind of overreacts to a virus and you feel symptoms. Remember, you're not getting sick because of the actual virus. You're feeling the symptoms because, you're not feeling the symptoms because of the virus. You're feeling the symptoms because your immune system is overreacting. Kind of like that with your nervous system. Your nervous system is there to overreact to a potential threat because it wants to make sure you survive. So you have to be aware of that. That's why it's so important to be in tune with it, but not necessarily buy into it. So you want to be aware of those the breathing changes, your heart rate changes, the hair standing up on your arm, the little spidey sense in the back of your neck, maybe you feel a little perspiration, feeling a little flushed. All these different changes are signals that something you have to pay attention to. So that's the first step in the journey. Internal physiological awareness, starting to do that, practice that on a regular basis. This is something that on an everyday basis, you can take time. You can do formal meditations, but you don't have to do formal sit-down meditations or even walking meditations. You can just become more aware of these physiological changes just by walking through your life and living your everyday life. So that's the first part. The second part is this external awareness. This is where it gets a little uncomfortable for all of us. We all want to believe that we are aware of how we show up and are perceived and received by other people. Of course, it's always good. But we also all know that person that, say, we meet in a social situation, or let's say in a work situation, and they make everybody else uncomfortable, and you ask yourself, like, how do they not know how they are coming across right now? Let's dial it back to the introspection illusion. So many people are just woefully unaware of who they are fundamentally at their most fundamental psychological structure and what drives them in their lives. So this is where external awareness comes in, or what we call situational and interpersonal awareness comes in. We have to understand how we affect others, but also how they affect us. There's a symbiotic relationship between people when they interact. We can't help it. It's nothing woo-woo about this. This is simple. This is simple biology. When we come into a situation, we are coming across in a certain way. We are activating people's nervous system one way or the other. And the response state of our bodies change, and the response state of the other person's body change. I've written articles recently about leadership and as well as just overall communication styles and conflict management. It all has to do with the impact that you have on others and how they impact you, specifically the state of their body. When I interact with you, and do I make you feel good? When we leave the conversation, do you think to yourself, well, Elliot was a nice guy? It's not about me. It's about how you felt inside. So that is the effect that I've had on your response state. If your response state shifts towards a negative around somebody, you're going to have a negative perception of that person. If your response state shifts towards the positive, you're going to have a positive perception of that person. This is done at an unconscious level. Again, remember, the nervous system is wired for your survival, so it's always looking for a threat. So shifts toward negative or positive tells the nervous system whether there's a perceived threat out there or not. And if the person you're interacting with thinks that you're potentially a threat, then clearly they're going to want to move away from the situation and back towards safety. And the conversation or the perception of you or the conversation is not going to go so well. So having this interpersonal awareness and the situational awareness is crucial. If you haven't noticed, it's based on internal awareness, though. The more you are aware of your own response state, the more that you can be aware of the shifts in your response state as you're interacting with somebody, but you can also be compassionately in tune with the response state shifts of another person. Are you paying attention to, do they become flushed? Do they shift in their seat? Do they lean back from you? These different ways that somebody can signal to you that there are changes in their physiological state of their body as you're interacting with them. This type of situational interpersonal awareness is crucial to get down. We are social creatures by nature. Living an optimal life has to do with how effective you are in having relationships with other people. You genuinely, of course, optimal life, everybody's optimal life is different, how they define their optimal life. But for the most part, us being social creatures and a very social species, living an optimal life likely has to do with, part of it has to do with how well you are connected with other people and the quality of your relationships that you have, both intimate as well as friendships and even acquaintances and work relationships. So all of this has to do with living the life that you want or your optimal life. So getting this right is absolutely crucial. So what do? Well, again, there's nothing that we teach in the ARAEt framework and the awareness. It's not about making changes at that point necessarily. It's more about just being aware so that you are prepared when you get into the later stages in the response management and the later stages of cognitive response therapy, that you start taking action based on that awareness. When you start to become more physiologically aware, that as you get into later stages of disrupting predictive response cycles or starting to identify what we call cognitive catalysts, which are triggers to negative predictive response cycles. If you have internal physiological awareness, you'll be better prepared to identify those cognitive catalysts. If you have situational interpersonal awareness, as you start to build these models of action plans and, again, identifying cognitive catalysts, a lot of it has to do with identifying how people are impacting you and how you impact others, and who is involved in both positive shifts in your response states or negative shifts in your response states. If you notice patterns in your life of people that have one effect on you or the other, that's really important to identify. So in the early stages, you don't necessarily make the changes, but you lay the foundation. This is why it's so foundational. you lay the foundation for leveraging that ability in later stages of the ARAEt framework, as well as the later stages of cognitive response therapy. So I really want to leave you today with an understanding of the importance of getting these foundational pieces of your therapeutic journey right. And if you're helping others through your coaching, or if you're a mental health professional with clients, it's absolutely crucial to help them get these foundational pieces right. That's why it's so important to become certified in the ARAEt framework or cognitive response therapy, because you'll be that much more effective in helping others to start and persevere through their journey. If they don't understand what is driving them in their lives, and when you start to introduce things like the challenge of change that I talked about in a previous episode, when they start to feel that internal resistance and it's pulling them away from the changes that they want to make in their lives, they're going to be confused. Why am I wanting to stop myself from making the changes that I said I wanted to make? Well, it starts with that type of awareness, of internal and external awareness of what drives you physiologically to move somebody away from that threat and towards safety. Change is energetically taxing to the person's system. So even if it's positive, it's still the nervous system says, no, I want you to stay the same. I want you to stay in the same patterns that you've always followed before, because so far you're still alive. So things seem to be going just fine. And you're like, no, things aren't. I want to change. It's like, well, as long as you survive, we're fine. It's like, no, I want to move beyond survival. I want to start thriving. So helping your clients in this first part is going to drive them throughout their therapeutic journey and help them become much more successful. So if we want to become agents of change in the new era of mental health, we have to make sure that we get these parts right. And this is how we make mental health more effective. So it's all about making mental health more affordable, accessible, and effective. But this effective part is all about those certifications in cognitive response therapy and the ARAEt framework, because when you integrate that into your practice, whether you're a coach or a mental health professional, or you're somebody that's always been fascinated in wanting to help other people, this is how we all become mental health. This is how we all become agents of change in the new era of mental health and really empower people to live their optimal life. I'll see you next time.